Did you know that most people overpay for their kitchen furniture? So today we will take apart my brother's old kitchen cabinets and make new plywood cabinets set on a hobby level CNC router in hopes of saving thousands of euros and learning something new. Since our CNC work surface is only 2.6 by 4 feet, we ran into a couple of challenges and had to get creative when making some of the components for the project by adding unusual joinery to the build and a little bit of epoxy to ensure the kitchen serves well in the long term. Well, at least longer than the one we took apart. The kitchen my brother had was made of laminated particle boards. In the first couple of years the kitchen probably looked fine, but once moisture gets under the laminated layer, it doesn't take long for it to get ruined. I understand that the particle boards are decent for builds like these and cost way less than hardwood panels or plywood. And yet everybody knows that ordering a custom particle board kitchen can cost starting from 5 or 6,000 euros. But I'm confident we can make a better one for far less. If we are successful with this build, I will do the cost breakdown of the kitchen at the end of the video. Anyway, while my brother and I took apart the cabinets, I was already thinking of ways to improve the kitchen so it's durable, easy to make and wouldn't take a couple of gigs to take apart. After we had some fun and had taken everything apart, I made a quick sketch of the new kitchen, took a couple of measurements and went to design the 3D model of the kitchen. My first thought was to make a giant cabinet for the bottom part and two large wall cabinets that we would attach to either side of the window, but I soon realized that it might be challenging to make them on a hobby level CNC router. So I designed different layout and function cabinets that we could place next to each other, and the modular system would make it super easy to make new layouts for kitchen builds in the future. Since this was my first kitchen project, it took some time to figure out how to make the cabinets and doors for the built-in appliances, as well as the correct placement for the hinges and undermount drawer slides. But once the cabinets were placed in the 3D model of the kitchen, we could start cutting the parts on the CNC router. I had this small pile of half sheets of plywood that was just enough for this project, so there was almost no room for errors. And since most of the cabinet parts were quite large, a lot of components had to be cut separately. This presented a couple of challenges. First, I had to find an efficient way to keep track of the components I had already cut, ensuring I didn't make the same part twice. Therefore, after each CNC operation, I changed the opacity of the completed parts in the Fusion 360. As a warm-up, I started with the parts for the wall cabinets. These fit nicely on the sheets and didn't take too long to cut. However, since the corner joints of the cabinets will be exposed, I didn't want to add the dog bones. Therefore, I had to manually clean out the inner corners of each finger joint. Nothing too difficult, it just took some time. When the parts for the wall cabinets were done, I started working on the bottom cabinet walls. Since the material I had wasn't a perfect square, there was only one good way to fit the parts on the sheet, and to avoid making multiple cuts with the circular saw, I had the idea of sliding the sheet through the CNC router. The problem was that our CNC was too close to the wall, so I had to improvise a little bit. For most of the bottom cabinet walls, I loaded the sheets halfway on the CNC router and supported the overhanging side with the sawhorses. This way I avoided slicing the sheets into smaller ones and was left with larger pieces of plywood offcuts that were good for some of the small components. When selecting the material for each cut, I had to be mindful of which surfaces would be exposed. Some of the sheets had these visible knots and patches that I didn't want to be seen, so I tried to hide all the material imperfections between the cabinets and have nice Baltic birch veneer on the surfaces that will be seen. Needless to say, material management added a little bit of difficulty when doing the CNC operations. When cutting the door components, we made the cuts for the hinges. This will save a lot of time when assembling the kitchen, since we won't have to do it manually. And soon enough I had most of the cabinet frame parts made. And before finishing up the rest of the components and proceeding with the sanding and finishing, I wanted to check if the cabinets would fit in the kitchen as intended. And I'm glad I did. The walls in the kitchen weren't as perfect as in the 3D model, so I had to make some adjustment cuts to be able to place all the bottom cabinets next to each other. I had predicted we might have to do that. So to simplify the adjustments, the cabinets on each side of the kitchen had grooves for all the shelves and floor panels instead of tenons like every other cabinet. This allowed me to adjust the angle of the cabinet walls as well as narrow them. in case they wouldn't fit between the kitchen walls. Once I had everything test fitted, I marked the holes for the water pipe and electricity for the appliances. Then I took everything apart and went back to the workshop. The test fitting probably wasn't necessary, and we could have done the adjustment cuts when installing the finished kitchen, but now I felt more comfortable making the remaining parts drawers and shelves. And now we had to cut the holes for the wires and the water pipes. To keep things simple and efficient, I realized the best way to make the cutouts is on the CNC router. All we had to do was to make a reference axis on the CNC's work surface for positioning the components, make a couple of G-codes, attach the parts to the CNC and make the cuts. It definitely took way less time than cutting the holes with a jigsaw. As the last of the CNC operations, I had to make the countertop. Since it was more than 3 meters long, I had to use the approach called tiling. So I cut some reference points in the baseboard, attached the material to the CNC and made the cuts one tile at a time. I will make a separate video on tiling and how you can use it to make larger components than your CNC's work surface. Since the sheets I had wasn't long enough for the countertop, I had to attach smaller part at one end of the counter. For that I used dovetail joint. To make the countertop look better, we attached the frame to the bottom of it. The frame will make the countertop look a little bit bulkier. It will also make it easier to attach the countertop to the kitchen cabinets. You know, the smaller risk for the screws to poke through. When the bottom frame was in place, it was time to trim the front edges of the countertop. For that I used 3/8 roundover bit. After the trimming, I gave the edge a quick pass with a belt sander, and of course the trimmed edges had to be sanded by hand. To sand the top surface, I used an orbital sander with 100 grit sandpaper. Since this was the part of the kitchen that would get the most attention, the top had to look flawless. But before we get too carried away with the sanding, I first had to trim the cabinet edges. However, I had to be cautious not to trim all of them. Since the cabinets would be placed next to each other, I thought it would be cool if the cabinet walls would look like one 30mm thick plywood sheet. To achieve that, I had to be careful not to trim the edges between the cabinets. So I placed them one by one on the sawhorses and made the trim with a handheld router. And after I was done with the larger parts, I could attach the trim router bit to our router table and work on the smaller parts like the subtop, shelves and drawers. When all the edges were trimmed, came my favorite task, sanding. And considering how many relatively large sized parts we had, my joy wasn't short-lived. So I gave a couple of passes with an orbital sander to all of the components. When the large surfaces were nice and smooth, I clamped multiple parts together and sanded the edges as well. This approach sped up the edge sanding quite a lot, but for everything to be smooth, I had to sand the trimmed edges by hand. I didn't check the time, but I'm sure I spent at least 10 hours sanding the parts, and I enjoyed every second of it. Anyway, before applying the finish, I had to clean the sanding dust from the parts. For that, I used a damp cloth. It takes longer than blowing the parts with the compressor. However, the cloth doesn't kick up a dust cloud in the workshop. To ensure the clean parts dry properly, I put them on our paint drying rack and let them dry for an hour. When all the parts were clean and dry, I could start applying the finish. I used the water-based lacquer, and to speed things up a little bit, I used the larger size paint roller. It was great for the large surfaces. To make it easier to apply the finish to the component edges, I used the workbench box attachments. This gave me enough room to work on the plywood edges without switching to the small paint roller. The bottom cabinet walls were a good test for the paint drying rack. To be honest, I wasn't sure if the rack would be able to support the large part, considering the paint rack was made to support parts half their size. When the first paint rack was full, I worked on the next parts and started to fill up the second one as well. By the time I had both racks full, the components I had worked on first had already dried, so I could apply the finish to the other side as well. The quick drying time is one of my favorite things about the water-based finishes. It means for larger projects like these, I don't have to spend time just waiting while the lacquer dries, but can spend all of the time working on the parts. Anyway, after we had the finish applied to all of the cabinet parts, I could start sanding off raised wood grain to prepare for the second coat of lacquer. Thankfully, this didn't take as long as the orbital sanding. I just had to give a couple of passes with the 300 grit sandpaper to all of the surfaces, and we were more or less ready for the next coat. Well, almost. I had to clean up the sanding dust with a damp cloth again. This way I can be sure there is no dust left when applying the second coat of lacquer, therefore having a better quality finish on the project. After I had gone through all the parts, I could start applying the finish for the second time. Considering that the cabinets will be placed next to each other and the outside surfaces won't be visible after the kitchen is installed, I decided to apply the second coat only to the surfaces that will be exposed, inside of the cabinets, outside of the wall cabinets, and of course the front edges. This meant I could save a little bit of lacquer and most importantly some time. And soon we had the parts done, and we were more or less ready to assemble the cabinets. The only thing we hadn't finished was the countertop. It has the edges trimmed and the top surface sanded. However, there was a small thing I had to fix before we could apply the finish. As you remember, we made a dovetail joint to connect the large countertop piece with the small one. At the time of making it, I was quite sure that it would be a good idea to give the dovetail joint edges a pass with the trim router. This left a small groove that wasn't ideal for kitchen use. If we left the joint as is, it's just a matter of time before the groove would be filled with the breadcrumbs and other small food pieces. To prevent that, we had to fill the grooves with epoxy. However, since we won't be using epoxy as the finish for the countertop, I decided it was a good idea to add the water-based finish to the joint. The finish would cover the wood grains and contain the epoxy only in the joint. And after the lacquer had set, I added a little bit of hot glue at both ends of the dovetail joint to prevent the epoxy from spilling over. And it was time to pour the epoxy with a hardener. Mix it and pour it into the groove. And now it was just a matter of waiting for the epoxy to cure. To save some time when installing the kitchen, I thought it was a good idea to start assembling the cabinets. Since all of the work surfaces in the workshop were taken, I had to make a new one. So I laid a sheet of plywood on the floor, which will help me to avoid scratching the finish while assembling the cabinets. First, I worked on the wall cabinets, and assembling them was super simple, just adding the back panel to one of the sides and then attaching the rest of the components. To secure the corner joint, I added a screw in each finger joint. Where the cabinet walls were exposed, I had pre-drilled an 8mm hole for the screws to go in. The idea was to cover the screw holes with a plug made out of wooden dowel. The plug was not only functional but also gave an interesting look to the corner finger joint. It wasn't long before I had assembled all 4 of the kitchen wall cabinets, so I thought it would be good to free up some space and attach the door panels to them. For that, I needed to secure the mounting plate fixings to the cabinet walls and add the hinge cups in the door panels. Since I had marked the screw holes for the fixings and made the cup holes on the CNC router, installing the hinges and attaching the door panels didn't take long, and the assembled cabinets looked incredible. So I was anxious to assemble the bottom cabinets as well. I started with the simple one-door cabinet. The first step was to attach the back panel to the cabinet floor. Then we could attach the assembly to one of the sides and add the other side on top. To secure the parts in place, I added a bunch of screws. This time they won't be visible, so there was no need to cover them with the dowel plugs. And that sped up the process quite a bit. The cabinet was more or less ready. We just needed to attach the sub-top components, secure them in place, and attach the doors. And just like that, we had our first bottom cabinet ready, and we could work on the rest of them. Since I used the CNC joinery when cutting the parts for the cabinets, the assembly was super simple, just attaching one part to the next one and securing them together with a handful of screws. The drawer cabinet and open shelf cabinets had a little bit more components to install, but it still wasn't that difficult. After an hour of work, I had all of the kitchen cabinets assembled. Now it was just a matter of finishing the countertop. The next day, when checking out the epoxy pour, I noticed something that I hadn't anticipated. In one place, the epoxy had gone into the joint cap, which meant we had to add more epoxy and wait for it to cure. Thankfully, the next day the epoxy had cured nicely and we could sand it off with the orbital sander. The bad news was, it was very cold outside and in the workshop. So after finishing up the sanding, I decided to bring the countertop inside the office to finish. Again, the first step was to clean all the dust from the surface before we can apply the finish. When it was done, I waited a couple of minutes and started to apply the finish to the countertop. Since the top will have the most contact with the kitchen user, I decided to apply 3 coats of lacquer. After the last layer, I went outside to load the cabinets in the trailer. It was freezing outside, so we didn't do much filming there. But my brother and I managed to pack all the cabinets and bring them to his house. Since I had assembled all the cabinets in the workshop, it didn't take long to install them. However, before placing them one by one in their position, we glued these small plastic pads at the bottom. Somehow we miscalculated how many of these we would need, so we had to use one pad for 2 cabinets. After installing the drawer cabinet, my brother had a surprise for me. He had added an outlet at the wall where the sink cabinet should be. Since I thought I had made all the necessary cutouts on the CNC router, I didn't bother to take the jigsaw with me, so after marking the positions of the outlet hole, I drilled a bunch of holes all around the marked line. My brother had these weird looking drills that surprisingly didn't leave any tear out on both of the back panel sides. Anyway, after removing the offcut piece, I cleaned the edges with the chisel and we were almost ready to install the sink cabinet. We first had to attach the tubes for the wastewater to go to. When that was done, the cabinet slid into the position nicely. The next was the dishwasher cabinet. So we slid the walls on the dishwasher, attached the sub-top panels, took it closer to the other cabinet, put some tubes through the cutout holes and placed the whole assembly into position. Before adding the next cabinet to the kitchen, we quickly attached the dishwasher's door panel. It looked fantastic, but we still had a lot of things to accomplish, so without much hesitation we placed the stove cabinet and the regular cabinet in place. The last cabinet needed some convincing to get into the position, but somehow I managed to get it done. When the bottom part of the kitchen was done, it was time to install the oven. We secured it in place with a couple of screws, checked if the doors worked properly, and went to secure the dishwasher in its position. To cover up the bottom of the dishwasher, I had to attach a small plywood panel. Since we had to be able to remove it in case the dishwasher had to be replaced, I thought it would be a good idea to use a couple of cabinet magnets to hold it in place. After making sure the panel and the dishwasher doors didn't collide when opening, we could attach the door panels to both cabinets. To avoid using any door handles, I had to install the push latch to both cabinets. I started with a small metal piece that had to be attached to the corner of the door. Then I could attach the latch base panel inside the cabinet and secure the latch in place. At first I was worried about how well the push to open system would work, but it turned out great. To free up some space, we decided to install the wall cabinets. The idea was to attach plywood plank at the back of the cabinet, secure it in place with a couple of screws, and attach the same size plank to the wall that the cabinet will rest on. Normally for this I would consider using French cleat system, with the connecting edges being at 45 degrees angle. However, this wasn't an option since we wanted the cabinets to be right under the ceiling. So we lifted the cabinet, slid it on the wall attachment and secured it in place with a couple of screws. Then we took the same steps to install the cabinet next to it and installed the door panels. So it didn't take long to have the cabinets on the right side of the window installed, but it didn't go as smoothly on the left side. The wall there wasn't as even as the one on the right side, so we decided to secure the cabinets together before attaching them to the wall. After installing the planks at the back of the cabinets as well as on the wall, we could lift them and secure them in place with a couple of screws. When that was done, we installed the doors and attached the push latches to all of the wall cabinets. The kitchen was slowly coming together and there wasn't that much left for us to do, so without much hesitation we started work on the drawers. I assembled the first drawer box by installing the back panel in the floor components and attaching the side parts. When those were in place, I attached the front of the drawer box and secured the whole assembly with a handful of screws. When the first drawer box was done, I gave it to my brother to install the undermount drawing locking devices at the bottom of the drawers. In the meantime, I finished the rest of the drawers and started attaching the runners at the drawer cabinet sides. I probably should have done this step in the workshop. It would have been a more convenient and efficient solution than reaching into the cabinet while laying on the floor. A few moments later, my brother had installed all the locking devices and I had finished working on the runners, so we were able to attach the drawers to the sliding mechanism. Since this was my first time using the undermount drawer slides, I'm glad the installation process went without any major hiccups. Anyway, we still had to attach the drawer front panels to the drawer boxes, so while my brother held the front panels in place, I secured them from the inside of the cabinet, and one drawer at a time, the cabinet was finished. By the way, we added the drawer under the oven as well. It will be great for storing pans. At this point, the last task was installing the countertop. so we carefully placed it on the counters and secured it in place by adding plywood screws through the subtops. This should be enough to secure the countertop. After placing the last screw, it was time to install the appliances. We started with the stovetop, connected the cables to the outlets and inserted the stovetop module in the countertop slot. Then my brother attached the water connections for the sink and the dishwasher and installed the sink assembly. When everything was in place, we added silicone to secure the sink in place and prevent water from leaking under it. The last of the appliances we had to get in place was the cooker hood, so we inserted the hood in one of the wall cabinets and attached the filtration system at the bottom, and the kitchen was more or less done. However, to consider the project as completed, we had to attach a splashback panel. For that, we decided to use these giant tiles, but to fit them in place we had to make a couple of cuts and bore some holes for the outlets. After gluing the tiles to the walls, adding some silicone and installing the outlets and the LED strips, the kitchen was finally completed, and it was surprising how well it looked, considering we made it in a garage workshop with only a hobby level CNC router and some basic tools. Thanks to push to open mechanics, we could avoid using cabinet handles, making the door panels nice and clean. The 3mm offset between the door panels and the cabinet walls created this dark edge that accented the light birch wood, and the dark gray splashback tiles added some contrast between the wall cabinets and the countertop. Needless to say, the kitchen looked quite fancy, and that raises the question, how much did it end up costing? And did it make sense to make the kitchen ourselves instead of ordering a custom built one? So let's do the price breakdown. I created a spreadsheet of all the materials we used for the kitchen, starting with the plywood and concluding with the appliances. So the first thing first, we spent around 575 euros on plywood and only 145 euros on the furniture fittings like hinges, drawer sliders, screws, etc. Since we purchased them directly from the distributors, we got extremely good prices. Then we spent around 110 euros on the materials for finishing. This includes lacquer, epoxy and sandpaper. Other expenses like tiling, electrical installation and LED strips ended up costing only 112 euros. So total on the materials we spent 937 euros 87 cents. Also my brother purchased a new stovetop, oven, dishwasher, sink and fridge, which totaled 1455 euros. So all in we spent a little less than 2400 euros both on materials and new appliances. It was a very good deal considering the quotation for a custom particle board kitchen was over 5000 euros. Of course, it did take a lot of hours of CNC cutting the parts, sanding them, applying the finish and installing the cabinets. But in the end, we made something that will serve well for many years and will be a good compliment magnet from all the house guests. Thank you for joining us on this journey, and I'll see you in the next video.